pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6, king to g1, knight to e4, rook to e1, knight to d6, knight to e5, bishop to e7, bishop to f1, knight to e5, rook to e5, king to g8, pawn to d4, bishop to f6, rook to e1, rook to e8, pawn to c3, rook to e1, queen to e1, knight to e8, bishop to f4, pawn to d5, bishop to d3, pawn to g6, knight to d2, knight to g7, knight to f3, bishop to f5, bishop to f5, knight to f5, queen to e2, pawn to c6, rook to e1, knight to g7, bishop to e5, knight to e6, bishop to f6, queen to f6, knight to e5, rook to e8, knight to g4, queen to d8, queen to e5, knight to g7, queen to e8, knight to e8, rook to e8, queen to e8, knight to f6, king to f8, knight to e8, king to e8, pawn to f4, pawn to f5, pawn to b4, pawn to b5, king to f2, king to f7, king to f3, king to f6, pawn to h4, pawn to h5, king to e3, king to e6, king to e2, king to e7, king to e1, king to e6, king to e2, king to e7, king to e3, king to e6, king to e2,